Hello and welcome. Before we begin, I want to give everyone 30 seconds to log in as we're expecting many attendees for today's webinar. If you're just joining us, we're just giving other attendees a few moments to get logged into the system as we're expecting a high level of attendees for this webinar. Okay, I think it's time to get going. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the Spectre of ESG Compliance, a global paradigm. My name is Jack Halliday and I'll be running today's webinar. Before I hand over to today's speakers, I would like to remind all attendees to please engage as much as possible by asking questions. If you have any audio or visual issues or questions during the broadcast, please message in the chat box. Also want to remind you that today's session is being recorded and a full version of the recording will be sent out after the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to today's moderator and the Vixio Global Managing Editor, Joe Ewens.
Hi everyone, a real pleasure to be here today to moderate this webinar on ESG compliance. A really excellent panel today to talk about this quite meaty subject. I mean, ESG is at once, I think, both a buzzword and quite an intimidatingly deep well of specialist knowledge, but like it or not, a real understanding of environmental, social and governance issues is becoming central to running a modern gambling business. Already, we're finding that good corporate ESG practices are finding themselves merging with new compliance requirements, often, must be said, issued by bodies with regulatory reach that extends far beyond the usual cast of gambling authorities. But even with that all in mind, and I know it's a lot, don't panic. Today, we've assembled a uniquely qualified group of experts to demystify what it means to be a compliant ESG forward business in 2024 and beyond. I'll introduce the panel. We've got Rachel Dekalis, the Associate Director of Environmental, Social and Governance at KPMG Malta, Sandeep Prasad, the Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at Ontario Lottery and Gaming, Becky Harris, Distinguished Fellow in Gaming and Leadership from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and our very own Zach Birnbaum, Principal Analyst here at Vixio. Right, there is a lot for us to get into and lots of places we could start. And for that reason, actually, I think, although we're going to talk about most of the kind of key likely subject areas that need to be considered when you're trying to run a sustainable gambling business, when we think of ESG and compliance, it's also extremely important to evidence how you're approaching sustainability. That's really very key to the rules that we're seeing coming out. So we're going to talk about that first, and partly because that process really helps companies hone in on what it is that they should be focusing on when it comes to ESG policies. So Rachel, I'll begin with you, if I may. Could you explain the concept of materiality, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot with ESG, and double materiality, an even more ominous sounding term?
Indeed, thanks, Joe, and really good to be here with all of these distinguished panelists. So the concept of materiality it essentially explains relevance. So when it comes to ESG and sustainability, we're talking about a whole broad range of topics. It could range from climate change to waste management, to pollution, to things like diversity, responsible gaming, cybersecurity, tax transparency, anti-money laundering, everything under the kitchen sink. Which of these topics are most important to report on? Or we use the word materiality. So which of these topics are the most material to report on? Now, the concept of double materiality was introduced by the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And it requires you to look at materiality or relevance from two lenses, what are known as the outside-in perspective and the inside-out perspective. That is, what risks and opportunities, what financial risks and opportunities does a particular sustainability matter present to the organization? And the inside-out perspective is what impacts does the particular organization have on people or the environment with respect to this particular topic. I'll give an example to bring it a little bit more to life. My background is from the environmental sustainability space. That's where I started out. So climate change is a topic that I hold close to my heart. So a gaming company, for example, can have a carbon footprint and can cause climate impacts, for example, through its use of energy, not only in its own operations, but also in its supply chain, for example, in data centers and business travel. That would be the inside-out perspective. But climate change as a topic can also be a topic of concern that presents risks and opportunities to a gaming company, for example, in respect of security of electricity supply, in respect of rising energy costs, in respect of generation of renewable energy and the opportunities that come with that. So this materiality assessment is one of the first steps that a company does in order to determine what are the relevant ESG topics to consider.
Okay, thank you. I think that helps explain it quite a lot. Although the concept of materiality and double materiality, the language might stem from EU legislation. Certainly, the practice is a global one, and it's not as though reporting on ESG issues is coming out of nowhere. It's something that certainly bigger companies are already doing. But it would be interesting to ask. I'll start with you, Becky, if I may. Are there good examples that you're aware of in terms of reporting on ESG?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, you've got to start with priorities, right? You've got the priority of the individual company, and then you've got the priority of the gaming regulators and the public policy of the jurisdiction at large. So there are several different mechanisms through which ESG gets assessed, and it gets even more complicated as you look at a variety of different jurisdictions for any particular operator. So I think some of the things that need to go into an assessment of what good looks like in the gaming industry is, first and foremost, their economic impact. Many of these publicly traded companies are reporting earnings in the tens of billions of dollars. They're massive companies that have a huge impact in our communities and in the world at large. And so when you break that down in terms of economic impact, we're looking at things like wages. How much money are they paying their employees to fulfill their responsibilities? How much money are they paying in taxes to their local jurisdictions to help pay for important things like social services and infrastructure and food for women and children in need through the tax dollars that are collected, which are often in the billions of dollars. And then what's their investment in their local communities? And that often is as much as tens of millions of dollars. Of course, in the gaming space, responsible gambling is always a critical piece of an ESG framework because it's a privileged license, and we recognize that like other types of activities people can engage in, there are a proportionate number of people that have experienced harm and could have some mental health consequences like addiction and other things. So being sensitive to the patrons and the people who access the products and services is critical, and making sure that there's a pathway and a plan to help them access any resources that are available is important. I think an emerging issue for gaming companies is in cybersecurity. How are they protecting information and security and privacy, not only for their patrons, which is critical, right, especially with all the data breaches we see from other companies, but with regard to their vendors and their patrons and their employees and all of the different stakeholders that they work with. When we're looking at a global perspective, sometimes upholding human rights becomes a critical piece of a company's ESG. Maybe not so much in jurisdictions like the UK and the United States, but certainly with an eye towards upholding human rights in some of the jurisdictions in which they operate, where there may not be strong government frameworks to make sure that the appropriate protections are in place. would be critical. And then a component of human rights, regardless of what jurisdiction you're operating in, becomes human trafficking. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. There's been an increased emphasis on making sure that gaming companies have a plan to deal with human trafficking, not only as we've recently seen in the Philippines and in other jurisdictions, but in the US as well. There are plenty of programs and opportunities to help casino personnel become acquainted with what that might look like and what to look for and what they can do to help people that are in distress. In terms of making an impact in communities, a lot of gaming companies are very, very generous. One of the new trends in the US is to have a community engagement plan when a new casino is opened in a particular jurisdiction. There's a lot of philanthropy that goes on in the gaming industry, and that can be in kind in terms of products and services. That can be through employee volunteer hours, where the employer pays them their regular salary as they go out and they volunteer, or they volunteer on their own. And that can also be through financial contributions from a foundation or from an employee giving fund or something like that. Often, particularly in the United States, there are back to school campaigns where children who are in crisis or who are in poverty are provided with the school supplies that they need to be successful. And then, of course, there's that food security component as well. Along the lines of dealing with our communities is also a commitment to supplier diversity and vendor diversity, making sure that we're incorporating and using the right levers to help groups that might have been historically disadvantaged or who don't have the same level of visibility in our society, and making sure that partnering with those types of companies so that we've got better representation and better economic opportunities for all people in a community is important. And then, as Rachel mentioned, obviously paying attention to the environment is critical. So how are they looking for net zero carbon emissions? What are they doing in terms of food preservation? What's being done in terms of making sure that trash and other things don't make it to a local landfill, recycling programs, energy efficiencies? What kind of renewable energy would the casino or the gaming company be involved in? And then just across the company, what are we doing with regard to waste just generally? How are we responsibly using the resources that the company has access to and that they utilize every day in being able to function in their business?
I think that illustrates the vast subject areas we could potentially cover when we're talking about ESG, and we'll delve into some of the ones you mentioned there more in depth in a little while. But that illustrates the sort of thing that needs to go into these reports, evidence of how our business is reacting to all of those issues. Sandeep, if I could come to you next. This reporting that we're talking about here is, in some senses, a form of communication, both outwardly, potentially to your consumers, but also to regulators and authorities. I mean, how does that element of this weigh on kind of good reporting?
Yeah, so communication of the reporting is critical. So one of the central principles of ESG is transparency and accountability on your material topics, governance, and progress. And so quality reporting helps to get you there. It gives you integrity to what you claim or what you say to your varying audiences. And it also helps for comparison with competitors, which may be important for some of your audiences to make sure that they can see that comparison as you're looking across that. So it's very important to get your reporting right, and right for you as a company for where you are on your maturity, because you have to be clear that it's not just a cookie cutter that one reporting here, one reporting there, what matches everybody. You have to match for your maturity. At OLG, we're at the very beginning of that journey. So meaningful sustainability reporting aligned with ESG reporting frameworks with high data integrity is a way to demonstrate how seriously your company is taking ESG and considering and acting on ESG risks and opportunities within the organization. And also that you're allocating resources to this, you're taking action. So at every moment, there's an opportunity to communicate how seriously you're addressing your material topics. So it shows how you're managing the governance framework and the mechanics in the organization. So is it integrated into board conversations? Is there an ESG committee? Those are different ways of communicating the seriousness of ESG and how you're doing that. But as I said, there are many different audiences for ESG and sustainability information that have to be considered when developing your reporting strategy and communication, and the disclosure and format of your reporting. So some of those audiences are, of course, your customers, then employees, investors and market rating agencies, and then, of course, regulators and the communities that you work in, as Becky mentioned, and then clients or suppliers you're aspiring to do business with. So let's get to the format of ESG reporting, which is the main kind of communication tool for it. So it could be a standalone report. There's lots of lengthy PDF reports that are out there that are important. And but that lengthy PDF report and data sheets may only be relevant to a couple of those audiences, as I mentioned, particularly investors and regulators and so on. And you have to, and also for potential clients when you're responding to RFPs, because ESG is becoming more and more common within that. So how you communicate is also relevant in that aspect. But ESG reporting content, you're using that to communicate with other audiences, to tell the story of the organization. So to take that wonkiness of ESG and that technical kind of aspect and to figure out how do you communicate it in a relevant and non-technical way to the audiences, the other audiences being customers across the organization, communities. So how do you use that quality reporting for customers to showcase how a company is moving forward on issues that are relevant to those customers? And it may not be all of the issues that are relevant. That requires some research and some conversations with your brand and communications team. But also for employees, reporting and demystifying it and communicating it in a way helps you to stay accountable to your employees, to say, we've made this commitment and together, this is what we are doing. And also across the organization, there's always lots of resistance to say, is sustainability kind of an add-on? Is it kind of an impediment? But how you communicate sustainability and ESG to demonstrate how it is advancing business objectives, including your operational and financial business objectives, it has to be done by the sustainability team. Otherwise, it will lose the narrative for the organization and its relevance. It's not just about doing good, it's about doing good business as well. And so for the format for these audiences, that can change from that PDF report that's very static and very, very lengthy to social, online, point of purchase, etc. And getting the right message in the right place at the right time for these audiences. But the principles of the storytelling and the communication has to be authenticity, to make sure that everything's being done in an authentic way. You're talking about outcomes and not outputs. It's not that we gave this much money over there, but what is the impact? What is the outcome, not only for that community, but for the business as well? And also stay quiet in your storytelling, I think would be my recommendation. And have those who are being impacted tell the story for you. As much as you can have those voices communicating the story, I think it's very important. That has much more impact than the company saying, we did so many good things. And also incorporating it into your corporate strategy, because that has power in that it's incorporated across the business and not just in a siloed way. But lastly, what I'll say is just don't be daunted by ESG reporting. As much as this conversation, we're talking about a vast range of things. I think we start, of course, with materiality and start from where you're comfortable with what your material topics are and what you can report. And do that in an authentic way and have rich data to support it, because that is going to get you a long way. And then you can mature as you go along and be transparent about where you are. And that kind of aspect of kind of being transparent, making sure you're clear about where you are and having data to support things is very important as you're moving along and communicating ESG.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's talk about, well, all the things you've spoken about there. There are lots of good reasons in there why you might want to think very hard about your reporting. But one very big one that Rachel, you've already alluded to in the EU, is that there is a pretty big piece of legislation that's come into effect, the CSRD, that's going to require a certain amount of reporting. So again, another topic we could talk about for a long time, but in brief, could you sum up what the CSRD is and what it means for businesses doing, gambling businesses doing trading in the EU?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and one that we're often asked by clients in this space. So essentially, the CSRD is a directive that came into force recently, and it requires all large or listed companies to start reporting on their ESG disclosures. The first wave of reports will cover the financial year 2024, and these will require large public interest entities, which in the case of gaming companies would be the ones that are listed on EU regulated markets, with more than 500 employees to report. So the report would be issued in 2025 over FY 2024 data. In the next year, so FY 2025, you get all of the large companies, even if they are not listed, requiring to report. Large companies or groups within the EU. There are quite some definitions over there, but to make it simple, we define a large organization as one that exceeds 2 out of the 3 criteria that I'm going to mention. So we're talking about 50 million in net turnover, this is euro, 25 million in total assets, or 250 employees. If a company or group exceeds 2 out of these 3 criteria in the EU, then they are considered to be large. So the first thing that a company needs to do is determine where it falls under the CSRD. Is it impacted by the CSRD? There are requirements even for listed SMEs, but those come in later. When is it impacted? Which entities need to report? So that would be sort of the first step, right, to map the landscape. The second step would, of course, be, what do I need to report? And this is where the double materiality assessment that we started off with becomes very, very relevant. The reporting requirements under the CSRD require you to report under specialized standards called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS. For those of us listening who have a financial background, these are the ESG equivalent of the IFRS. So these ESRS, if you had to report on all of the data points, you have over, I think, 1,200 data points that need to be reported on. So this is where the materiality assessment comes into play. So as Sandeep mentioned, the materiality assessment is important because it makes you think and look at what topics are relevant, but it also cuts the problem down to size, right? Especially as you're doing this for the first time. Ideally, you want to have something that is a little bit more manageable to do. The third thing you need to do is keep track of these developments. So one of the things that the EU Commission has said is we're going to keep updating the reporting standards. We're going to be issuing sector-specific standards. Last April, the Commission issued some implementation guidance. So how are you going to keep track of these developments going forward? And last, but also very important, is who is going to be responsible within your entity to drive this. Do you need a new role? Do you need a head of sustainability? Is someone from compliance going to take this on? Is the CFO going to do this? Is the CEO? Where is this going to sit? And importantly, no man or woman is an island. So often what we find is, yes, there is a central driving force championing this within the organization, but then they would need information from different teams, whether it's HR, whether it's finance, whether it's legal, across geographies as well. So you need to get data across geographies, from procurement, when you need data from your value chain as well. So you really need to get this hub humming within your organization where you can get the data to report on ESG. But more importantly, because why are we doing this? Why are we reporting on ESG? Why has the EU decided that CSRD is important. Ultimately, what we want is to drive a process of transformation. It's examining where we are on ESG, how we are doing on ESG, and trying to do better. So the role of the central person coordinating ESG efforts is also to champion the transformation of the organization towards a more sustainable and resilient organization into the future.
Thank you. So we can see in the EU that there's a pretty serious compliance challenge coming with the CSRD. Zach, is there any prospect in the US of either at state or federal level of something similar happening? Is there anything that exists at the moment that you're aware of that requires some sort of ESG compliance?
Sure. And to start us off, people on the call may have some familiarity with data privacy protection, which is going to kind of follow the same vein as ESG when it comes to the US, which is to say that the state of data privacy in the US is very much state by state, fractured. Different states have different levels of diligence, whether that's California with the CCPA or Colorado with their Data Privacy Act. ESG is much the same. Since March 2021, 41 US states have enacted in some form a version of ESG related legislation. Those pieces of legislation have primarily focused on one aspect of ESG, which is climate related reporting. So when we talk about the states, it's important to remember that the federal regulator, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission when it comes to ESG, has a role to play. However, the states are what drives the conversation. So importantly, when we talk about ESG in the States, it's important to remember that ESG is a fraught political word in the US. And this is going to be crucial to understanding the state of ESG within the US. So as I mentioned, since March 2021, 41 US states have enacted some version of ESG legislation. Of those 41 states, 21 have enacted anti-ESG legislation, which prevents ESG being a factor when trying to invest in where it's fossil fuel, any industries that have that kind of high level potential ESG component to it. Similarly, the SEC in March attempted to take a leading role when it came to ESG standards within the United States. They enacted a rule in March 6, 2024. In April 2024, 25 US states have sued them and blocked the standards from being enacted in the Fifth Circuit of the United States District Courts. So it's a very much a contentious issue. It's very much an issue that the US is trying to form some kind of uniformity, form some kind of standard. But much as we've seen with the GDPR being transposed in the US and the CCPA in California, it's very much an issue of the states need to drive the conversation to put pressure on the federal entities to enact this. However, I suspect with the CSRD directive impacting a number of American-based businesses, that it's an issue that will put pressure to be able to actually wrap this up. And again, ESG, climate is one aspect of ESG. As Becky has mentioned, cybersecurity is a crucial one and one that increasingly is taking bulk of my time, bulk of state legislature's time, and is another aspect that we're definitely going to see some kind of legislation, regulation. But the thing to remember with the US is that the likelihood of seeing a comprehensive directive in the format of CSRD is slim to none. It's much more likely that we're going to see bespoke sector-specific standards being enacted, whether they be cybersecurity, climate change, human trafficking, human resources, or the like.
Joe, would it be okay if I weighed in? Would it be okay if I weighed in from a company perspective real quick?
Mm-hmm.
So just like what Zach just said, there's probably going to be specific company or specific sector-based guidance, right? So in 2016, the Nevada Gaming Control Board actually enacted a compliance plan unit because a component of ESG generally is to de-risk your business, right? That's one of the reasons, one of the benefits that companies engage in ESG. So what they learned is that in terms of due diligence requirements, suitability expectations, there was really no uniformity, not only state to state, but within company to company within a particular jurisdiction. Because in the United States, anything that's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution goes to the states for regulation. And so the states regulate gambling. And that's why we have a variety of different gaming regulators and regulatory standards. And so that's why public policy and company priorities become so important. But essentially in Nevada, since 2016, all publicly traded companies and then other companies designated by the Gaming Control Board are subject to a compliance plan where they go in and they report to the Gaming Control Board on the items that are articulated in compliance plans. And there's a real effort across the gaming industry to make these compliance plans consistent among companies. And that's all done with an idea toward helping the regulator have a deeper understanding into sometimes tangential issues, but sometimes core issues. So standardizing what a key employee is, because they're subject to licensing, has become a critical component of these compliance plans, as is suitability, right? Because the licensee's ability to engage in gambling activities and keep their license all hinge on suitability expectations and the ability of their vendors and their officers and directors to be able to pass suitability investigations. But one interesting component of Nevada gaming company compliance plans is non-routine regulatory inquiries. And this is an attempt for the gaming regulator, who may not have direct responsibility for things like anti-money laundering, because that's FinCEN or components of the IRS or maybe even FBI or the Department of Justice. It's a requirement for gaming companies to put the regulator on notice that they've had an inquiry so that the regulator is aware. And as we're seeing, anti-money laundering issues are coming to the forefront in Nevada right now. And it's important from a regulatory compliance, from an ESG compliance, and this governance-based component of ESG, that gaming regulators are on top of what's going on with regard to their licensees, and that they're given the heads up in terms of potential problems and challenges so that they can work through challenges and coordinate with other agencies to de-risk gambling for the companies, for the state regulatory agency, for the taxpayers, for the patrons, and anybody that has some kind of a connection as a stakeholder to gambling.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Becky. Sandeep, we've seen Ontario emerge over the last few years as quite an influential jurisdiction, certainly on the rest of Canada, quite possibly, and I think globally as well. I mean, what does the situation look like, either on a province level or a national level in Canada, in terms of rules and regulations?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, while there are different kind of pieces of legislation that rule different material topics, I'll talk about some of the most recent ones that kind of talk about that are specific to some of the key ESG issues that we've been talking about. So and these are largely federal. So one of them is the modern slavery legislation. So the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act. So that came into effect on January 1st of this year. And the act requires entities that produce, purchase, or distribute goods in Canada to submit and publish a report to the Federal Minister of Public Safety. And it outlines the measures that are being taken to address, prevent, or reduce forced or child labor in their supply chain. So OLG fell under that, and lots of other companies fall under that legislation. And but again, being very realistic about where you are, but also demonstrating your plan as you move forward is the reporting requirement there. The second is the Canadian Competitions Act and Bill C-59. So the Bill C-59, there was an amendment aimed at greenwashing that came into effect on June 20th, 2024. And that's to prevent misrepresentations to the public and misinformation. So for example, around composition, production, and et cetera. So this is catching up, I'm sure, with the EU and where things are at. But in looking at this, it's looking at scope, so prohibition on product-specific misleading environmental benefits. There are penalties that are associated with this, so monetary penalties that are quite large, around some going up to $10 million. And then also looking at methodology. And then, but at this point, there's a feedback period for this bill that just ended in September. So that we look forward to seeing what the feedback was. And then there's also federal climate disclosure that came in 2022. So federally regulated financial institutions and federally crown corporations have to publish climate disclosures aligned with TCFD by 2024, so this year. Why that's relevant to us is that there's now additional federal climate disclosure that has just been issued on October the 9th. And that climate disclosure has now been expanded to include private companies that are large federally incorporated corporations. So you can see this kind of trickling down, and it is coming. And so this is going to make amendments to the Canada Business Corporations Act to determine the substance of the disclosure requirements. But the plans are to develop a new sustainability investment taxonomy as well. And that's been asked for some time, and to categorize sustainable economic activities aligned with the goals of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And so those are some of the key pieces of legislation that kind of show that things are trickling down, although that it may not be relevant to certain companies. I think it's anticipating that this is going to get further and further down the chain. And of course, there's the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board that has recommended adopting the ISSB standards. And that will then, as the federal government said, they want TCFD disclosure. As we all know, ISSB and CSSB now kind of encompass that. So it may be a move moving, although disclosure will still be relevant of TCFD, it'll then move to ISSB is kind of the likely scenario. So these are some of the key pieces that can see the momentum building around the disclosure requirements and the legislative framework for ESG.
Thank you. I think it's the direction of travel there is pretty evident. That's very interesting. Thank you. You mentioned climate there. That gives us a nice segue. Let's move on to talk about some of the specific issues beyond the obvious, which is to say responsible gambling, which hopefully by now all gambling companies should have a pretty good handle on their responsible gambling policies and impact. I'm interested in anyone's views on this, but I'll start with Rachel, as I know it's your background. Climate impact's not necessarily the first thing that a gambling company might think to consider, but it is definitely a part of the picture. I mean, what's your view on how gambling companies should be approaching reporting on climate change?
Absolutely. It's a really important question on climate, simply because we're already feeling the impacts of climate change already. So this is something that even if our emissions were zero, we're already feeling the effects of extreme weather events and hurricanes and storms and tornadoes, and over here in Malta we've had extreme heat and so on in some jurisdictions, wildfires and so on. So even from an adaptation perspective, this is something that companies are going to have to deal with. Drought, for example, rising sea levels, and so on. So this was in fact climate change and extreme weather events were one of the long-term top 10 risks perceived by CEOs in a recent World Economic Forum global risk report that was published in 2024. So there's the whole adaptation piece and the whole consideration of how is climate impacting us, even if we as gaming companies do not contribute to climate change. But in reality, gaming companies do contribute to climate change. Of course, we have to make the distinction between the land-based and the online operators. Land-based might have more direct emissions through consumption of fuel, for example, consumption of electricity, which could be quite significant for heating, cooling, lighting, and so on. But then there is also the value chain emissions aspect to consider. And this would also consider things like, for example, business travel, which can be quite significant when you're traveling by plane, for example, employee commuting, things like data centers and the very power-hungry considerations that need to be mentioned there. And of course, with climate change, it's a question of every little helps, right? Every little effort that can be done to reduce the impacts of climate change can help go towards a better future. Just to give a little bit of statistics, so we know that in order for us to keep climate impacts to a reasonable level, we need to limit global warming to around 1.5 degrees above the baseline that was there before the Industrial Revolution. We're now at around 1.1, 1.2 degrees above that baseline. And with the current policies that we have in place, we're on track to exceed the 1.5 and go to 3 degrees Celsius. So more needs to be done from a policy angle, perhaps, but also from a private company perspective. So every company needs to be looking at its carbon footprint, not only of its own direct emissions, but also the emissions in its value chain, and engaging with suppliers and stakeholders to try to bring that down as far as possible.
Thank you very much. Let's talk for a second about cybersecurity. It's been mentioned as a topic already. Obvious operational reasons why you might want to keep your business secure from internet malfeasance, but how does this interface with ESG? I mean, Zach, if I could start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think it's one of the more crucial elements. I would say the CSRD is actually required disclosures of cybersecurity related sustainability. So in previous iterations of standards, where it's the NFRD or GDPR or the like, there was a lack of uniformity of how to report on cybersecurity issues. When the GDPR came through, it changed that approach and was able to establish some uniform standards across the EU. Now in CSRD, it's one of the more crucial aspects of the reporting standards under ESRS S4, which is essentially regarding consumers and end user impact. One of the more impactful things on consumers and end users is data privacy. So in the gambling world, that can be anything from KYC, from responsible gambling data, from any data pertaining to your player information within your databases. So one of the things that is important in CSRD is basically how do you secure that personal data, that PII, personal information of your end users. So cybersecurity is something that we have seen in the gambling world, where it's the attacks on Caesars and MGM in past falls, or interactions with iGaming platforms in the Philippines that cause issues with data. It's one of the fundamental aspects regarding gambling companies that needs to be addressed in the CSRD. So cybersecurity, it's like whether it is the collection of data that leads to risk to fundamental rights of privacy, whether it's the actual data use of the personal data that player may consent to do. It's all about reporting on the impacts, potential and likely, on that user data with a fundamental look at consumer protection when you're reporting on this. So for me, in the gambling world, I would say that cybersecurity is the number one issue that a company needs to look at when it comes to reporting standards, whether it's ESG or other requirements that it may be pertaining to.
And if I could just
Becky,
jump in,
come in on that. As Zach mentioned, there've been okay. Sandeep started talking first, so Sandeep, you go first. I think everyone has something to say on this. So Sandeep first.
I'll be brief. I mean, looking at the World Economic Forum risk report earlier this year, in their global risk perception survey, they ranked global risks by severity over the next 2 and 10 years. And it was largely dominated by environmental issues, but featuring in the top 10 is misinformation and disinformation cyber insecurity, and adverse outcomes of AI technologies, and also AI-generated misinformation coming to the fore in the unknown. Like you can see that, with the advent of AI, and also this is also an environmental kind of layer to that of, AI kind of taking up 10 times more energy than a Google search. It kind of also layers into that. But you could see the anxieties that are coming, and I think I totally agree with what Zach's saying, that it's such a topical issue, and it definitely is a material topic for us, and I'm sure for many corporations.
Yeah, and just to jump in quickly, Joe, on the AI front, that's the other thing with the data element. AI uses in RG are increasing, whether it's to personalize a chatbot to be able to intervene for a at-risk patron, whether it's to personalize a user experience on the actual UX front on a gambling company. The use of data, personal and company-wide, that an AI use entails increases that cybersecurity risk exponentially, whether it's personal data security or even company data security on the data you're training your AI on that you're trying to intervene on. The use of AI being a trend that over the last 2 years has increased in the gambling community, and frankly is set to increase over the next 5 years, is something that really puts data protection, cybersecurity, and data privacy at the forefront of all these types of conversations.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to come to Becky next, and then to Rachel. So Becky first, and any thoughts on cybersecurity or indeed climate as well?
So I think that we're seeing the true value, the true economic value of the gaming industry is in their data, which is why they're becoming subject to more cybersecurity attacks. So I'm always amused when I see movies about casinos like Ocean's 11 and those kinds of things where they're going after the house bank. So it's like you've completely missed the point. The real value in a casino are its customer data, the customer database, which largely doesn't have the same protections around it as a casino vault might have. And so I think making sure that the appropriate protections are in place to make sure that there can't be penetrations into the data, to make sure that data is difficult to access, that only the correct employees or the appropriate employees have access to those customer databases. What are you doing to protect player protection cards and preventing those from being created or utilized or manipulated in some way? And this is, again, just another huge topic, but I think paying attention to the value and the information that your data contains is really critical and important for gambling companies.
Thank you. Rachel, go ahead.
I don't have anything further to add on cybersecurity because my colleagues here have really explained this eloquently, but I do want to add one thing. ESG risks are business risks. They are not separate things. So companies would do well to not just look at their performance and profitability from a financial perspective, but also from a non-financial perspective. And this is what the drive towards ESG, whether it's in the EU, whether it's in the US and Canada and other jurisdictions, is doing. It is to create an environment where businesses are sustainable and resilient into the future. And this means ensuring the long-term survival of the business with minimal harm to people or the environment. I think if we keep this objective in mind, and then we start looking at ESG not just as a compliance exercise, but as a value-adding exercise, then this changes mindsets completely. And then we can start looking at ESG as driving profitability. I'll mention, for example, a topic that is also close to my heart around gender diversity and diversity in general. So we know that companies with more diverse boards and a more diverse workforce are more profitable. So how about using that data and transforming companies towards more diverse companies to make us more profitable and more sustainable into the long term? We've seen data from the European Commission that shows that companies that are more sustainable, we call this in the technical lingo, more taxonomy aligned, are actually more profitable as well. So there's a lot to be said about companies that are really prioritizing taking action on ESG risks, leveraging opportunities, which will then make them into more sustainable and resilient businesses into the future.
Thank you. Yeah, Sandeep, do you want to have any thoughts on that? I think you used a phrase something like good ESG is good business or something earlier. I mean, that seems to align with that.
Yeah, doing good and doing good business. Yeah, I think that I completely agree with my colleagues, and picking up on Rachel's point around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and such an important topic for any organization. I think it's, there's been a lot from ESG reporting around the diversity aspect and representation. And now it is, I think the focus is should be around equity and inclusion and belonging. And how do you demonstrate that value? And it's not by virtue of just having an equity deserving person within an organization, but it's also having a safe environment for everyone to express their views, and for that to be also EDI being put within the strategy, put within the corporate strategy, as well as the ESG strategy, and layered in throughout, as well as Indigenous peoples' relations. And how is that kind of layered throughout? Particularly, that's relevant, of course, for Canada specifically, and for the US a little bit as well. So I think that, how do you do that, and how do you deal with those issues are very important. And climate risk, I just to go back to that for a second, climate risk is business risk. And when you have floods, wildfire smoke, extreme heat, this is affecting your customer coming out. It's also affecting your data centers, and it's also impacting your supply chain. So your costs of materials are going up. And so it's affecting both sides of your income statement. And how are you planning for that to adjust for forecasts and for budgeting to be able to act on these things and take the appropriate mitigation measures as well to be able to manage that risk? And that needs to be well within your enterprise risk management framework, as well as an ongoing board discussion and an executive discussion within the organization. So, I'll stop there, and that's. But great points by everyone.
Agreed. Thank you very much. One thing you kind of mentioned it there, and something that's stood out to me as perhaps not immediately obvious when companies are looking at ESG is how much they need to consider the supply chain, their supply chain when they're looking at this. If I could ask Becky first, I mean, how relevant is it for gambling companies to consider their entire ecosystem when they're looking at ESG?
Well, I think it's becoming more of a state priority. So if you look at Maryland, for example, when they did their gaming legislation, they required gambling operators and gambling companies to work with diverse companies and allowed for people with a lot of diversity intersections to be able to qualify for gaming licensure. That was part of their public policy that was important to them. A lot of jurisdictions for about the last decade have required gaming companies to step up and, in addition to apply for licensure, provide a community engagement plan that also provides for diversity within the supply chain, within their vendors, and within other gaming stakeholders. So I think it's becoming more and more critical. And I think that ties into the diversity, equity, and inclusion discussion that we've been having. One of the things that I've been doing in my time at UNLV is we actually launched a diversity, equity, and inclusion survey to survey the workforce in the state of Nevada, so that as we're working with regulators and legislators and gaming companies, we actually have the data on the Nevada workforce to talk about where that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging piece sits, and how we can help companies become more intentional, as well as policymakers become more intentional about ensuring that across all levels of the company, both laterally and vertically, how we can make sure that there's the right kinds of inclusion in terms of representation at entry level, at managerial level, at the executive level, and at the board level. But in addition to that, how are we looking at things like culture and belonging and setting the right kind of tone within the company so that people have the ability to show up with their whole self and engage in productive conversations about what potential customers might like. Caesars actually comes to mind in terms of going after certain demographics of business that were marginalized and not feeling like they had adequate representation. So the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, rates businesses based on how they interact with the gay and lesbian community, and Caesars decided they wanted that piece of business, and they've got an incredibly high rating from the HRC, and they are seen as a very friendly business, and a lot of people from those types of representation, people who see themselves in those types of demographics, come to Caesars and know that they're going to be treated well by the employees, that they're going to have an awesome experience, that Caesars cares about them as a demographic, that they're going to be treated fairly, and that they're not going to be discriminated against. And I think that goes back to doing good and doing good business.
If I could jump in, Joe, quickly. Yeah, I think like one of the important things to remember, and I think it was Rachel that mentioned earlier with ESG being tied to good governance and being a sustainable business, the same thing applies to DEI. It shouldn't be disassociated from good corporate governance, good way of doing business. When you have diversity of thought and you've got diversity of experiences, inherently you're going to reflect the community you serve. So where that's like your client base, where that's your community engagement plan, the more like your community, whether it's your business community or your local community that you do business in, the more that reflects the actual reality, the more sustainable your business is going to be, the more likely you're going to be able to cultivate institutional knowledge, the more likely you're going to be able to have correct initiatives, whether that's LGBTQIA plus initiatives, whether that's racial initiatives, whether that's veteran initiatives. If you have people in your organization that fit that identity and are encouraged to voice their identity experiences and add that and enrich your corporate strategy, the more sustainable your business is going to be for the long term.
As we've been saying, ESG is good business, right? So as Becky and Zach have been saying, it's a way to attract and retain customers. It's a way to attract and retain employees as well, because, and this is also borne out by studies that we as KPMG have done, which shows that employees are looking for ESG values before they even decide whether to apply for a position. A segment of employees will have considered leaving an organization because the ESG performance doesn't match their expectations. And we know that talent attraction and retention is costly. So having a high turnover of employees costs companies money. There's loss of knowledge and so on, and retraining that needs to be done, and investment in hiring and so on. So I think this underlines the example. These examples underline this point really, that good ESG performance means good business. You know, it's doing well while doing good.
I think that's a fantastic sentiment to end on. Thank you all for your expertise and your thoughts. Really, really interesting topic, and I'm sure we could have spoken for several hours more. But there we are. We have to bring it to a close at some point. So thank you, everyone, and thanks to those of you who are watching. We'll see you again very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to our speakers. And of course, thank you to our audience for attending today's session. As mentioned at the start of the recording, the webinar was recorded, and a video will be sent to all attendees in the coming days. If you asked a question during the broadcast that was not answered, a member of the Vixio team will get back to you with a reply in the coming days. And finally, if you have any questions about anything discussed in today's webinar or would like further information, please email info@vixio.com or visit our website, vixio.com, for more information. Thank you very much for attending.